Righty. Well, I'm back after another fast-paced, exciting day. I went to work today, and that was nice. I saw the lady that I sometimes work with in town. I like her, and I like to go and see her, and I like to get out and do something different. And I was able to be of some service to her anyway. We got her car unstuck. Her car had frozen to the ground because she doesn't drive very much anymore, The car hadn't moved since mid-December, and it was just frozen right to the driveway. So we had to unfreeze it from the driveway and get it moving again. And one of her tires was flat, so we got it pumped up. And she had an appointment this afternoon, and so she needed her car. Got her garbage out for her too, and her cardboard recycling all cut up and piled up, ready to go on recycling day. Anyway, went into Perth and got some water. Took my pay from today's work and bought a few groceries, including a nice roast chicken, which I know Rocky really enjoys, and I enjoy it too. So we did all that, and was able to make a video at the old burying ground in Perth, and also was able to make a video at the underground city on the second line outside of Perth. I remember that when I was a kid. I remember going past there in a 1962 Pontiac with my dad when I was a little boy in the early 1970s. And it was at night, and I could see the big high antenna towers and all the red lights flashing on them and stuff. And I asked him what that was in there, and he told me there was a whole city underground in there, and it belonged to the government, and it was in case of a war. They could go down there and live underground and all that. The government could hide underground then if there was a big war. Anyway, so I made a video of that place. Anyway, it's been decommissioned and closed up for decades. They closed it up in the early 90s at the end of the Cold War. But I was talking a little bit about my old friend Jim McCann in a video yesterday. He was kind of an eccentric old guy, and he owned a property out in the Boonies, way out in the back country. And this fella had been buying up old cars when they weren't worth anything from the early 1970s on and parking them on the family farm property. Anyway, Jimmy was a good friend of mine. I always thought very highly of Jimmy, and I believe he thought highly of me too anyway. He trusted me. He didn't trust everybody, but he trusted me, and that was a big thing anyway. If Jimmy trusted you to be on his property around his cars and everything, then you knew you were well thought of by him. But here's the story, the story about Jimmy anyway. Jimmy McCann, I can tell these stories now because he's passed on, and I can tell these stories now without any fear of embarrassment or anything. I don't think he'd have cared anyway, really, but still, if some people are alive, I tend to be a little more careful, really, about what the stories I tell. Or if things were still how they used to be, if people were still really easily upset by things like cannabis cultivation and stuff, I wouldn't tell this story. But Jimmy, he had some affiliations there to outlaw motorcycle gangs and whatnot, Jimmy used to grow a little weed on his property there. Places where there weren't cars, and believe me, there was hardly a square foot of land out there that didn't have an old car sitting on it. But like I say, he'd been buying them since the early 1970s. He'd pay just a little more than scrap value and take it away and park it there. So he had cars from the 40s and 50s and 60s right on up into the 80s and even the early 90s at one point there. But anyway, it's funny, I used to see cars in there that I knew, cars that belonged to people that I knew back in the 70s and stuff, I remember there was a big old Dodge sedan in there that belonged to a man in town that I knew back in the 70s. And there was an old 39 Buick that belonged to a great uncle of mine and stuff, So there were different cars in there anyway that I knew from back when I was a little boy. But Anyway, Jimmy liked to grow a little bit of cannabis on his property. And Jimmy was kind of a character. At one point, he got raided by the RCMP. This was back in the 1970s. And they came in with the dogs. And they were going all over the property looking for dope. And Jimmy had a bunch of cannabis hidden in a tin can in a shed on a shelf with a bunch of other tin cans. Anyway, they took the dog in there into this little shed where Jimmy had all this junk stored. And the dog went all in through there, and he was sniffing all around the shelves and stuff, and the shelves were all full of old cans and bottles and things. And anyway, the dog actually sniffed the can with the cannabis in it and just went straight past it, didn't even know. And after the fact, Jimmy, when he told the story, he had a way of talking, he'd talk slow, very serious, and stuff, very thoughtful, and he'd stand sitting there telling the story, and he says, yep, he said, dog went into the shed there and was sniffing all over, went right past the can of dope. He said, don't know what happened there. Dog must have had a cold that day, he said. I remember their dog must have had a cold that day, he said. That was Jimmy anyway. There was one time he had a bunch of stuff from the old wool factory in town. Back in the early 1970s, my dad was a tool and die maker and an industrial mechanic. And he was working for a company, this is when I was a little boy, working for a company called Acrotex in Perth, Ontario. And Acrotex made synthetic yarn. And my dad, he was a kind of a mechanical genius, and he used to build stuff. He could build a thing out of just spare parts. He'd go into the junkyard and get parts, and he'd get parts out of old stoves and all sorts of stuff. He'd build stuff with it, And anyway, my dad had built a vacuum cleaner. It was like a robot vacuum cleaner. It went on a track, all through the factory, and what it did is it sucked all the fluff out of the air. That fluff in a factory like that, you're breathing that stuff in, it's not good for you. It can kill you. My dad, he had it anyway. It would go all through the factory, and it would suck up all the fluff out of the air. And you could remove it from the track, and there was a big canvas, black canvas with wire going through it, hose, with a great big cast iron bell on the end of it. And you could remove this machine from the tracks, and you could take it around and you could vacuum out all the machinery. So you get all the old fluff and crud and everything out of the machinery. Well, I was out at Jimmy's one time, and he had a pile of junk that he had gotten from the wool factory, because I guess they were retooling. A new outfit had bought it, and they were retooling. They were getting rid of all the old stuff. Anyway, I'm telling Jimmy the story about this vacuum cleaner that my dad had built. And I remember going into the factory. I saw this thing in action, and it used to terrify me, because I was just a little boy back then. My dad actually got fired for union agitation. My dad was the head of the union, and they were trying to get a union in there in the wool factory. And that idea got quashed. A lot of the men wanted a union because working conditions were bad and pay was low, and they weren't very well treated there. But the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, started taking down license plate numbers and harassing people. And that idea got quashed anyway. They intimidated people and scared them so bad that they didn't want any part of it anymore. And when that happened, any of the agitators that were behind the union movement, they, it's lighting my stove here, they got, there we go, they got fired and blacklisted and everything else. So my dad had to go to work for the shoe factory then in Perth, because my grandpa was head electrical engineer there, so he was able to get him in there. Couldn't get work anywhere else because now he had a name as a union agitator. But anyway, I'm telling Jimmy the story about this vacuum cleaner my dad had built, and it was all built out of junk. It was all built out of stuff from the scrapyard. And it worked beautiful, because I used to scare the hell out of me when I was a little boy, and I'd go in there. It moved really fast, and it was on this track, and it made this sound to go, you'd hear that as it was coming, that, and it used to just scare me half to death, I'll tell you. I had nightmares about that thing when I was a little boy. I was always afraid of it. I didn't want to get anywhere near it. And if I had to walk across that track, it was just a terrifying experience. For me it was anyway. But telling Jimmy this story, and Jimmy standing there listening to me, he says, oh yeah, he said, well, that's the hose for it over there on the wood pile. He says, I went over and looked, and it was the old black canvas hose with the bell on the end of it. The cast iron bell on the end of it. Anyway, that's just a little story about Jim McCann anyway. He's quite a character. I was in there one time, and I had recently had a bad experience there. I had taken really sick, and one of my relations, who I don't get along with very well, had tried to have me committed to a mental institution. I was suffering pretty bad. I had the pneumonia and everything, and this back in the early 1990s. And I was pretty frail when I finally got out from under that. I was pretty frail. I went out there to see Jimmy, and Jimmy said, oh, Tom, you're not looking good. You're not looking good, he said. What happened to you? And I told him the story anyway. Oh, yeah, he says, well, I wonder what these people would say about a guy like me who has an issue with compulsive collecting, he said, And I said, I don't know what they'd say, Jimmy, but probably it wouldn't be good, but who cares? Who cares what they say? I said, you're smart enough. I said, you'd beat them. I said, you wouldn't be put anywhere you didn't want to be. And he said, well, Tom, you didn't get put where you didn't want to be either, so there you go. Anyway, I like Jimmy. I miss Jimmy. I really do. I like to be able to go out and see Jimmy. Anyway, water's already steaming there. What do you know? Alrighty. Anyway, it's been a beautiful day. It's been a beautiful day. That's all. Funny, I get telling these funny stories. Oh, well. Yeah, I get telling these funny stories, and sometimes I end up not laughing. Anyway, Jimmy lived a good long life, though. He did. He was quite a character. You don't see characters like that too much anymore. It's funny, I remember one time he run for township council. The township was giving him a hard time because of the condition of his property and everything, They decided they were going to crack down on junk and just, old fallen down buildings and stuff. And so they give Jimmy a hard time. He decided if you can't beat them, join them and beat them from the inside, basically. So he run for township council. And Jimmy, he put signs up all over the place. And the other candidates, they all had really slick-looking signs, all printed up by a professional printer. Jim McCann, he had plywood, and he would just paint on the plywood. Vote Jim McCann, Letters all crooked and stuff. And somebody said something to me about it one time. They said, what's that guy with his signs, who's going to take him seriously with signs like that? And I remember I said, well, he won't waste your money. I said, if he gets in, he's not going to waste your money on stupid stuff. As I said, how much do you think it cost him to make all those signs? I said, he probably got as much money into two of those signs He's probably got as much money into all those signs as the other guys have into 2 of theirs, you know. So I said, you know, he's not going to waste your money. And they said, well, you got a point there, I guess, you know. And he nearly did get in, too. He was second runner-up. Like, he didn't get in, but he was just shy of getting in. There was one other guy that got more votes than him that got in. That's what happened. So even with his makeshift signs that people laughed at, he still nearly got in, you know. Anyway, that's it for now anyway. I just thought I'd tell that story, or a few stories anyway, about old Jim McCann. He's quite a character. Like I say, I miss people like that, you know. Yeah, quite a thing. Alrighty then, we'll talk to you later.